Comparison is the thief of all joy. Theodore Roosevelt. While this quote seems very simple to understand, so many people struggle to actually live by it or to put it into work. Who hasn't found themselves jealous of a friend for their fancy car, high-paying job, their seemingly perfect marriage, maybe even the way their kids act? Maybe you spent money on a really nice new toy just to show it off at your friend's dinner party. All of these things seem small, but what happens when they ruin your life? To illustrate this point, let's take a look at two guys. For now, we'll call one Jim and the other Bob. These two guys are actually very similar to each other. Both Jim and Bob are musicians. They were both in bands about to make it big. Both were unceremoniously kicked out of these bands shortly before they became household names. But this is where their stories start to differ. See, Jim decided he wasn't going to let this stop him. He decided he'd become so successful that his former bandmates would regret ever kicking him out. They would have to watch as he lived on a life of stardom and fame. He would use this painful event to fuel his success, and he did. He recruited some of the best musicians he could find, wrote and practiced new songs for hours, played as many gigs as they could get, and within a few years, they would have a record deal of their own. The band that he formed would go on to sell 25 million records and tour the world. Many regard Jim as one of the most influential musicians in his genre. Now let's look at Bob. Bob didn't find the same success that Jim did. He ended up getting married, having kids, and living a fairly normal life. He definitely didn't reach the stardom that his former bandmates would go on to have, nor the success that Jim did. If you compare these two stories, Jim has to be happier than Bob, right? Jim is actually Dave Mustaine, leader of the legendary heavy metal band Megadeth. The band he was kicked out of was maybe the greatest rock band of all time, Metallica. Bob is actually Pete Best, and while he continued to play music, you probably haven't heard anything he wrote. The band he was fired from was none other than the Beatles. In interviews later in their lives, one of these men voiced his happiness, and he was probably better off for what happened, while the other admitted he had never really moved on. You might be surprised to find out which is which. Despite Dave becoming world famous and rich beyond belief, he never really got over getting kicked out of Metallica. So much of his identity became tied to becoming more successful than his bandmates. He was wildly successful, but not compared to Metallica. Pete Best, on the other hand, had a horrible few years after being fired from the Beatles, but eventually met his wife, settled down, and had a family. In an interview in 1994, he said, "I'm happier than I would have been with the Beatles." Pete was able to find joy in what he did have, rather than wallowing in pity because he never became rich and famous. Comparison is the thief of all joy. Theodore Roosevelt. So, which are you, Jim or Bob? Do you spend your days looking at the things you don't have, comparing yourself to those around you, or do you find joy in simple things and appreciate what you do have? Thanks for watching our video. Got a book, quote, or saying that you'd like us to animate? Leave it in the comments below, and we'll do our best to make a video on it. While you're there, hit the like button, and please subscribe to the channel for more mental upgrades.